Tyler Knox walked into that courtroom like the charges meant nothing. 17 years old, murder trial, and he was leaning back in his chair, relaxed, unbothered, almost bored. As the prosecutor described exactly how Daniel Rivas died alone on that road, Tyler didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He just sat there, slow and steady, letting a small smile settle on his face like he was watching someone else's problem unfold. At one point, he turned, looked directly at Daniel's widow clutching her husband's folded flag, and gave her a lazy, casual wave, like she was nobody, like her grief was entertainment. He was absolutely certain his age made him untouchable. He had no idea the judge had already watched the video, every single second of it, and he had been waiting for this moment ever since. My stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and tell us what you think in the comments below. This is how it all began. It started on a quiet Saturday morning in a desert suburb just outside Las Vegas, a place called Red Rock Heights, where the lawns are tidy and the streets bake golden under an unforgiving Nevada sun. A 63-year-old retired firefighter named Daniel Rivas clipped into his bike pedals, adjusted his bright yellow jersey, kissed his wife Elena on the forehead, and rolled out onto the road he had ridden hundreds of times before. He was not a headline. He was not a target. He was a grandfather who spent 30 years running into burning buildings, and whose greatest joy now was a morning ride and a weekly breakfast with his granddaughter. But across town, 3 teenagers were already in motion, and by the time the sun reached its peak, Daniel Rivas would never come home. The fluorescent lights of the courtroom hummed like a held breath. Camera crews lined the back wall, their lenses trained on the defense table, where 2 teenagers in county-issue jumpsuits sat waiting for the proceedings to begin. The gallery was packed, cyclists in yellow ribbons, community members who had seen the news, legal observers, and at the center of it all, a family whose world had been shattered and who were now required to sit in the same room as the boys who shattered it. The air had the specific weight of a room where everyone knows that something important, something irreversible, is about to happen. And in the middle of all of it, Tyler Knox was smirking. He was 17 years old, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, and utterly unimpressed. He leaned back in his chair at an angle that bordered on theatrical, his cuffed wrists resting on the table as if they were accessories rather than restraints. He whispered something to the boy beside him. Miguel Herrera, 16, smaller, quieter, eyes darting nervously to the gallery and back. And Miguel pressed his lips together, trying not to laugh. They looked less like defendants in a murder trial and more like 2 boys fighting laughter in the back of a classroom. It would have been almost pitiable if not for what they had done. When the judge entered, the entire room rose, all except Tyler, who dragged himself upright with an eye roll and mouthed the word dramatic to Miguel as the Honorable Judge Raymond Hollis settled into his bench. So the court reporter's fingers began their quiet percussion as the judge adjusted his glasses and began reading the charges in a measured, deliberate tone. Open murder with use of a deadly weapon, leaving the scene of a fatal accident. Reckless endangerment. Each charge landed in the silent room like a stone dropped into still water. Tyler's response was an audible scoff, picked up clean by the courtroom microphone. A faint chuckle escaped him before he caught it. He leaned toward Miguel, voice low but not low enough. "Watch. They can't do anything. We're kids." The words were meant for one person, but they reached everyone. A woman in the front row of the gallery, Elena Rivas, 61 years old, widow, grandmother, are a woman whose entire morning routine had been erased by a single phone call from the sheriff's department, did not flinch. She stared at Tyler Knox with the steady, hollow focus of someone who has already cried every tear her body could produce and now simply watches. She clutched a folded American flag to her chest, the kind presented at retirement ceremonies, the kind that meant decades of service. As the prosecutor rose to speak and mentioned the victim's name, Daniel Rivas, Elena tried to stand briefly, instinctively, as if the sound of his name required her to acknowledge it physically. She faltered and sat back. And Tyler Knox, in full view of the gallery, the judge, and the rolling cameras, raised his cuffed hands and gave Daniel's widow a small, lazy wave. A ripple of horror passed through the room. Someone behind Elena gasped. A bailiff stepped 2 paces closer to the defense table, jaw tight. Tyler only shrugged and let his smirk widen, glancing at the cameras along the back wall with an expression that said he knew exactly what he was doing. His defense attorney leaned in urgently, hand on Tyler's shoulder, whispering something taut and insistent. Tyler pulled away, still watching the cameras. He had already written this story in his mind. Juvenile records sealed, a short stint in some facility with a gym and a counselor, a second chance that society was obligated to give him because of a number, 17, that he wore like armor. He had said as much in private messages recovered by investigators. He had told friends that juvie records vanish at 18, that the law would have to let him go, that people couldn't touch him. He believed it with the whole, uncomplicated confidence of someone who had never been genuinely held accountable for anything. Then the prosecutor requested to mark a piece of evidence. State's Exhibit 17, defendant's own cellular phone recording of the incident. On the large monitor positioned beside the jury box, a frozen frame appeared. It showed a cracked, shaky cell phone view through a car's windshield. Sky, asphalt, and ahead, in the right lane, a lone cyclist in a bright yellow jersey. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, but undeniable, was a reflection in the windshield. A teenage girl holding the phone, laughing, while a boy's voice from off-camera said 4 words that would define this entire case. "Hit him? Bet you won't." Judge Hollis studied the defendants for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of that room with the weight of a man who had seen many things and intended to act on what he saw. "These are not childish pranks," he said. "A man is dead. Do not mistake this courtroom for social media." Tyler smirked again, as if he found that comparison apt, as if this were still content. The judge's gaze hardened, settling on Tyler with an almost clinical steadiness. "If this evidence proves what the state alleges, this court will ensure that justice is done, no matter how young you are." The monitor's frozen image held, the cyclist, seconds from impact, the teenager's laughter barely audible through the courtroom speaker. The smirk on Tyler Knox's face had not yet disappeared, but the clock on it had already started. The story has to go back. Not because Tyler Knox deserves the narrative pause, but because Daniel Rivas deserves to be known as more than a victim, more than a name on a charging document. The morning that would end his life began the way hundreds of his mornings had begun, with the particular quiet joy of a man who had learned, through 30 years of dangerous work, to appreciate an ordinary Saturday. He rose before 6, brewed coffee in a kitchen decorated with his granddaughter's drawings, and pulled on the bright yellow cycling jersey that Elena always teased him about, calling it his safety suit. He kissed her on the forehead. He promised he'd be back before the heat peaked. He locked the front door with the unhurried care of someone who fully intends to return, and unlock it. Red Rock Heights sits on the fringe of the Las Vegas metropolitan area, one of those desert suburbs where Spanish-style stucco homes line streets with aspirational names and tidy gravel front yards. On early weekend mornings, the neighborhood breathes. Sprinklers hiss in the quiet air. The sun is still at a forgiving angle, and the streets belong mostly to dog walkers and cyclists. Daniel had ridden this community's roads for 15 years, first as a stress release during his firefighting career, later as a ritual that organized his days in retirement. He knew every dip in the pavement, every stretch where cars came too fast, every place where the shoulder narrowed into nothing. Neighbors from the cul-de-sac where Daniel and Elena had lived for 2 decades spoke of him in the days after his death with the specific tenderness people reserve for someone who was simply, consistently good. And he was the man who shoveled everyone's driveway without being asked. During the brutal Nevada heat waves, he checked on elderly residents who lived alone, knocking on their doors to make sure they had water and working air conditioning. When a family 2 streets over had a house fire, a grease fire in the kitchen, contained quickly but frightening, Daniel appeared at their door with a casserole dish and stayed for an hour to explain what the fire investigators' report would say. That was who he was, someone who showed up. His firefighting career had spanned 30 years, and his colleagues at Station 9 described him as the kind of veteran who made younger crew members better without making them feel small. He had walked into dozens of burning structures during those decades, which made hundreds of decisions under conditions where the wrong choice had permanent consequences. He retired at 60 with a full pension and a ceremony attended by 4 generations of his family. His granddaughter, not quite 2 years old at the time, wore a tiny plastic fire helmet in the family photographs from that day. Daniel kept one of those photos on the wall by the front door, straightening it each morning before he left for his ride. Himself in his dress uniform, soot-stained from a training exercise, he had refused to skip for the ceremony, holding the baby, flanked by his crew. On that last Saturday, he followed his usual route, a loop that took him past his old fire station, down the long commercial stretch, through the school district, and out toward the quieter roads where the suburb fades and the open desert begins. He had added one safety habit after a close call with a careless driver the previous spring. A small GoPro camera clipped to the back of his seat, angled to record the road behind him. He had told Elena it was just a precaution. "People drive crazy," he'd said. "At least I'll have proof if something happens." Elena had hated that he said that. It turned out to be the most important decision he ever made, though neither of them knew it at the time. While Daniel pedaled into the morning light across town in a cluttered bedroom decorated with gaming posters and printed out screenshots of social media follower counts, Tyler Knox was scrolling. He had been awake since late the night before, watching clips online, street takeovers, prank videos, are the kind of content where someone gets hurt and the comments section fills with people laughing and calling it legendary. He had texted his group chat before the sun came up. "Doing something viral today before summer ends. Who's in?" Miguel had responded with a string of emojis, something between excitement and discomfort. Kaylee had sent a voice note. "I'll film, but no one's getting hurt, right?" It was a question, but she asked it in the voice of someone who expected a reassurance rather than a guarantee. Back on the road, Daniel's phone buzzed inside his jersey pocket. Elena had texted him a photograph of their granddaughter crouched on the kitchen floor, pushing a toy fire truck with both hands, face scrunched in concentration and delight. The caption read, "Your little chief says good morning." The message showed as delivered on Daniel's phone, sealed in its pocket, wheels turning beneath him. He would never see it. The road ahead was long and straight and shimmering with early heat, and he had no reason to feel anything but glad. The rear GoPro blinked its small red light steadily behind him, watching the empty road. Then a gray car turned onto the same street, engine revving, 3 teenagers inside. Desert Ridge Road is the kind of stretch that looks peaceful from a distance. 2 lanes of pale asphalt cutting through scrubland, low traffic on weekend mornings, the horizon flat and open in every direction. Up close, it is less forgiving. No bike lane, no dedicated shoulder. Just a narrow strip of deteriorating pavement between the painted white line and the crumbling edge where the road meets packed desert dirt. Cyclists who used it regularly knew to stay tight to that right edge, ears tuned for approaching engines. Daniel had ridden it dozens of times and always felt the particular alert calm of someone navigating a space that was not designed with him in mind. He pedaled at a steady, unhurried pace, his yellow jersey a single bright point on a road that was otherwise empty. Tyler Knox had not planned to end up on Desert Ridge Road. That morning had begun without a specific destination, just the low, restless hunger for something that would look good on camera. He had taken his mother's boyfriend's gray Hyundai Elantra without permission. It's something he had done before and which had never produced any real consequences. He slid into the driver's seat, adjusted the mirrors like someone who owned the car, and waited while Miguel climbed into the passenger seat with one last nervous look at the house behind them. In the back, Kaylee settled in with her phone already live, recording short clips and posting them to her private story before they had even left the neighborhood. She zoomed in on the dashboard. She panned to Tyler's face. She added music. As they drove, Tyler accelerated in bursts, testing his reaction time, weaving between the sparse weekend traffic on side streets. The speedometer climbed to 70, then 80. Kaylee filmed the dashboard numbers and captioned the clip, "Going stupid." She laughed when the car fishtailed slightly on a curve. Miguel gripped the door handle and said nothing, smiling thinly when Tyler looked at him, looking away when Tyler didn't. They had turned onto Desert Ridge Road almost by chance. Tyler had spotted it because it was long and straight and open, the kind of road that begged you to find out how fast you could go. He pressed the accelerator. Then, in the distance, a yellow jersey. The audio from the reconstructed phone video, played later in that packed courtroom, captures the exact moment the tone shifted from reckless thrill-seeking to something darker. You can hear the engine pitch change as the car accelerates down the straightaway. You can hear Kaylee zooming in, narrating in a playful voice. "Look at this dude, all serious in his bike shorts." You can hear Tyler's easy, amused drawl. "Should I tap him? Just a little?" And you can hear Miguel's voice, quieter but audible. "Nah, man, don't. That's messed up." Met with nothing but laughter, his protest absorbed and dismissed as background noise, the way you absorb the sound of wind when you're moving too fast to care about it. Daniel's rear GoPro captured what he could not see. Frame by frame, reviewed later by forensic analysts and projected in front of a silent jury, the footage tells the story from the other side. The road behind Daniel, empty, then a small dark shape appearing in the distance, growing larger with a speed that is wrong, unmistakably wrong, the kind of wrong your body registers before your mind catches up. The car moved from the center of the frame to directly behind him with a velocity that the footage experts calculated at approximately 80 miles per hour. Daniel's body language changes in the final frames, a slight tension in his shoulders, a small shift of weight as he glances back. There was nowhere to go. Loose gravel on the right, nothing but speed behind him. Tyler's voice, sharper now, cuts through the audio. "Hit him. Bet you won't." A beat of silence. Then Kaylee. "Do it. I'm filming." What happens next takes less than 2 seconds of footage to capture and will take a lifetime to unhear. The yellow jersey fills the windshield. There is a sound, not the clean cinematic crash of movie violence, but something worse, something wet and percussive. And the phone's view jerks violently downward as the car makes contact. Daniel's GoPro, at the same instant, captures an explosion of motion, the car lunging into frame, the world spinning sideways, or then the asphalt rushing upward into blackness as the camera hits the ground. Inside the car, for one fractured second, there is only chaos. Someone screams, high-pitched, involuntary. Then another voice, breathless, almost laughing. "Oh my God, did you get that?" Miguel. "Turn around, dude. We gotta stop." But there is no stopping. The engine surges. The speedometer, glimpsed for one frame, is still climbing. In the rearview mirror, the road behind them empties. The chapter of their lives in which they were just teenagers making a stupid, catastrophic choice is already over. The chapter in which they are people who drove away from a dying man while laughing has already begun. The desert road falls silent again, and Daniel's rear light blinks on in the still air, recording nothing, seeing everything. of the silence after catastrophe is its own kind of violence. Desert Ridge Road had been loud with engine noise and spinning tires and the terrible sound of impact, and then nothing. Just the ambient drone of insects in the scrubland, the distant pulse of wind against the rocky hillside, and the sun pressing down on the still form of a man who had left home that morning planning to be back before it got too hot. Daniel Rivas lay face down on the asphalt, one foot still clipped into a twisted pedal, his bright yellow jersey now streaked dark. His helmet had cracked along the left side. The rear GoPro camera lay several feet away, its little red light blinking on. Patient, unaware, still recording the empty road. The first person to find him was a man named Mark Tully, a 47-year-old plumber driving home from an early morning job site in his pickup truck. He saw something bright in the road from a distance and slowed instinctively, squinting through his windshield. For a moment, his brain refused to process the image correctly. The bent wheel, the crumpled figure, the dark stain spreading on the pale asphalt. He pulled over, left his door open, and walked toward the scene with the careful, slow steps of someone who is afraid of confirming what they are seeing. He stood over Daniel for one terrible second. Then he pulled out his phone and called 911, his voice breaking on the first sentence. "There's a cyclist on Desert Ridge Road. He's not moving. I think somebody hit him and left." The dispatcher's voice was calm and practiced. Should the specific calm of someone trained to be a steady anchor in the worst moments of strangers' lives. She walked Mark through it. "Don't move him. Check for breathing. Check for a pulse." Mark knelt on the hot asphalt, blood on his hands before he even realized it had happened, counting compressions the way the dispatcher instructed, his voice breaking every few counts as he recited numbers into the phone. The sound was terrible and intimate, the sound of a stranger trying desperately to give back something that had already been taken. The dispatcher stayed on the line, timing him, guiding him, her voice never wavering even as Mark's shook apart. Scattered in a rough semicircle around Daniel were the artifacts of impact, a shard of red plastic from the car's taillight, a tire marks that veered hard toward the shoulder before disappearing back onto the road, Daniel's cycling glove lying palm up a few feet from the white line with its fingers still curved as if reaching for something. Mark noticed Daniel's small GoPro camera lying nearby, the red light still blinking. He didn't touch it. He couldn't have explained why. Instinct, maybe, or some half-remembered idea from a crime show. But he left it exactly where it was, still active, still recording the empty road behind it. Sirens cut through the desert air less than 10 minutes later, a fire engine, an ambulance, and 2 sheriff's cruisers arriving in quick succession, dust rising from the shoulder as they pulled up. Paramedics moved with the focused urgency of people who have learned not to let hope override assessment. They checked Daniel's pupils, on his airway, his pulse, and one of them, a young woman with ink-stained gloves and a face that gave nothing away, exchanged a glance with her partner that said everything the situation required without a word. A senior deputy unspooled yellow crime scene tape, walking a careful perimeter, his boots crunching on broken plastic and fractured asphalt as he documented the scene. At the Rivas' home on the quiet cul-de-sac, Elena was wondering why Daniel hadn't texted back. The coffee had gone cold. She rinsed his mug twice. She wiped the kitchen counter that didn't need wiping. She checked the window, checked her phone, told herself he had probably stopped to talk with someone from the cycling club, told herself there were 100 perfectly ordinary reasons why the road was taking a little longer today. 2 patrol cars turned onto her street with their lights off. That specific, dreadful courtesy that law enforcement extends when they are about to break someone's world open. Neighbors watched from behind curtains as 2 uniformed officers walked up her front path with their hats in their hands. Elena's phone buzzed on the table. An unknown number, the 911 center, calling the emergency contact on file. She reached for it without knowing yet that answering it would divide her life into before and after. On Desert Ridge Road, a deputy crouched beside the GoPro and picked it up with gloved fingers. He held it up, noticed the red light still blinking, and paused for a moment, as if processing the significance of that steady pulse. He pressed the button to stop the recording. The light went out. The camera was sealed into an evidence bag with a label and a case number and handed to a technician who would later describe what it contained to a silent jury. For now, it was just a small device in a plastic bag, but it was the most important object on that desert road, a silent witness that had watched everything, that had never looked away, and that was about to help ensure that the people who drove away laughing would never forget what they had done. By the time Detective Sarah Kincaid of the Nevada Highway Patrol's Major Accident Investigation Team arrived on Desert Ridge Road, the scene had the particular stillness of a place that had already given up its most urgent secrets and was now waiting for someone to collect them. The body had been transported. The paramedics and most of the patrol units had cleared out. And what remained was yellow tape, chalk outlines, numbered evidence markers, and the kind of careful quiet that descends over a crime scene when the immediate chaos has passed and the methodical work of truth-finding begins. Kincaid was known in her department for two things: a near-total absence of panic under pressure and an obsessive attention to the kind of small detail that other investigators sometimes talk themselves out of caring about. She stepped out of her vehicle, scanned the scene from left to right, and said nothing for a long moment. The forensic sweep revealed more than the initial reports had suggested. Crime scene technicians measured the skid marks with precision equipment, feeding the data into calculation models that would later tell them the impact speed was likely between 70 and 82 miles per hour. The absence of significant braking marks before the point of contact was noted in the initial report with a kind of cold clarity. There had been no attempt to stop, no reflexive swerve, no moment of hesitation before the car connected with Daniel Rivas. The tire impressions were cast in rubber compound, their specific tread pattern and a slight misalignment on the rear left, logged for later comparison. A small, distinctive shard of red plastic was photographed, measured, and placed in an evidence bag, a fragment of a taillight assembly, potentially linking the vehicle to a specific make and year range. At the forensics lab, the GoPro footage changed everything. Detective Kincaid stood behind a technician as he connected the camera to a workstation and loaded the final recording. They watched Daniel's ride in silence, the early morning streets, the familiar route, the relaxed cadence of a man in his element. Then the car appeared in the rear frame. The technician enhanced the final clear frames before impact, frame by careful frame, isolating images that other eyes might have dismissed as too blurry or too fast to use. What emerged was significant: a partial license plate, a shot of the car's front right headlight and cracked bumper edge, a specific decal visible in the lower left of the windshield, and a unique scrape pattern along the hood's passenger side. Kincaid leaned closer. "Run it all," she said. The taillight fragment matched a component range used in Hyundai vehicles between specific model years. The tread pattern from the cast tire impressions aligned with a performance tire brand commonly fitted to those same models. The license plate, partial, cross-referenced with DMV records filtered by color, make, and general model year, produced a manageable list of vehicles registered in Clark County and adjacent areas. Simultaneously, a detective working the security camera angle pulled footage from a gas station on the edge of the Desert Ridge Road stretch, a camera positioned above the pump islands with a wide-angle lens that captured the road. Approximately 20 minutes before the estimated time of impact, the same gray Hyundai appeared, driving fast, slightly erratic, 3 occupants visible through the windshield. 2 boys and a girl, all laughing. The convergence of evidence, partial plate, vehicle type, gas station footage, GoPro frames narrowed the field to a handful of registered vehicles. One name stood out: Eric Danner, a mechanic living in Red Rock Heights, registered owner of a gray Hyundai Elantra. No criminal record, No apparent connection to Desert Ridge Road, no obvious motive. Detectives approached his address not as a primary suspect visit, but as a follow-up on a vehicle of interest. What they found when they turned onto his street made the careful, measured approach irrelevant. The gray Hyundai was parked in the driveway. The front end was visibly damaged, right headlight cracked, red taillight housing broken on one side, the kind of frontal damage consistent with a high-speed collision with a soft but dense obstacle. Paint transfer and road debris were still embedded in the lower grille. Kincaid stepped out of the car and stood on the sidewalk, looking at the vehicle. A forensics tech would later find traces consistent with a bicycle's components and clothing material in the cracked front grille. The evidence was already assembling itself before a single warrant had been served. As Kincaid walked toward the front door, she glanced up at the house's second floor. A curtain on an upstairs window moved, quick, barely perceptible, and then fell still. Someone had been watching and had stepped back. Kincaid looked at the mailbox by the front path, reading the name printed in stick-on letters alongside a second name beneath it. She said it quietly, to herself, the way you say something when you want to fix it in your mind. Danner. And Knox. Eric Danner answered the door after a long pause, long enough that the detective standing beside Kincaid shifted his weight and cleared his throat. When the door finally opened, Eric looked tired in the bone-deep way of someone who works physically demanding shifts and hasn't slept enough in years. He wore a grease-stained work shirt, and his eyes moved from the badges to the damaged car in the driveway with the specific expression of a man who has just been shown something he was already half afraid of. His hands, Kincaid noticed, trembled slightly. "Is this about an accident or something?" he said. It was the kind of question that contains its own reluctant answer. They moved inside, to a living room that told its own story. A house maintained by someone too busy to fully inhabit it, with mail stacked on a side table, on takeout containers on the kitchen counter, and a teenager's shoes and jacket piled near the stairs. Eric explained that he'd worked a double shift and come home to sleep. He hadn't looked closely at the car when he got back, hadn't noticed the damage. His girlfriend, Tyler's mother, was working. Tyler sometimes borrowed the Hyundai without asking. Sometimes turned out to mean regularly. When asked if Tyler was home, Eric paused just a half-second too long, then turned toward the stairs and called upward with the strained, careful tone of a man trying to sound normal. "Tyler, can you come down right now?" The footsteps were slow, deliberate, unhurried, the pace of someone managing their own entrance. Tyler Knox came down the stairs barefoot, hoodie pulled up despite the desert heat, and stopped at the bottom step to survey the room. His eyes tracked the detectives with a quick, assessing intelligence, flicking to their badges, to Eric, to the front window where the damaged car was visible through the glass. And something moved behind his expression. Not fear exactly, more like a rapid internal recalibration. Then the mask settled back into place. He said, "What's up?" in the easy tone of someone who has decided that casualness is his best available tool. Questioned about using the car that morning, Tyler's story shifted in real time, adapting as each version ran into evidence it couldn't explain. First, he hadn't taken it. Then, confronted with the gas station footage, he had borrowed it just for a quick drive, but they hadn't gone anywhere near Desert Ridge Road. Then, when told specifically that a cyclist had died on Desert Ridge Road that morning and that evidence suggested the car had been there, they had been on that road briefly, yes, but they hadn't hit anyone. Maybe they hit a sign, maybe a rock. He kept his tone light, slightly bored. The performance of a boy who knows that tone is a kind of strategy. What he could not perform was appropriate shock at the news that a man was dead. He displayed none. Kincaid watched his face carefully and wrote a word in her notebook. Flat. Miguel Herrera was identified through phone records. His number appeared repeatedly in Tyler's call history in the hours surrounding the incident. When officers arrived at the small apartment where he lived with his mother, they found him already pale, already visibly rehearsing a story in his head. His mother, a slight woman in her 40s who went still with a particular kind of dread when she saw the uniforms, stood with her hand pressed to her chest as Miguel's composure fractured under questioning. He kept saying he had told Tyler to stop. He kept saying he hadn't wanted anyone to get hurt. He said it with the desperate repetition of someone hoping the words will function as a retroactive erasure of everything that followed them. Officers noted his anxiety, his visible distress, genuinely different from Tyler's clinical calculation. Kaylee Porter came in with her parents, her father's hand on her shoulder, her mother already crying quietly in the hallway. Kaylee sat at the table with her own attorney and clutched her phone against her chest as if its physical warmth could offer some form of comfort or protection. Her eyes were red and swollen. She answered questions in short, careful bursts, volunteering nothing, contradicting nothing, protecting something. Though whether she was protecting herself, Tyler, or simply the world she had known before that morning was not yet clear. When asked about videos from the day, all three teens gave the same answer in different registers. Tyler with a shrug, Miguel with a stammer, Kaylee with a long silence. Nothing to see. It's gone. At the digital forensics lab that same evening, a technician was running recovery software on Kaylee's seized phone, methodically reconstructing deleted data from the device's memory. Deleted, as every digital forensics specialist will tell you, is not the same as gone. Not on modern smartphones, not when the data hasn't been fully overwritten, not when the phone hasn't been factory reset and then physically destroyed. What emerges from a patient reconstruction can be startlingly complete. Timestamps, audio packets, video fragments, partial file names. The technician worked through the night. At some point after midnight, he called Detective Kincaid over to his workstation. On the monitor, a recovered file list populated slowly. Near the middle of the screen, a partially reconstructed file name appeared. Desert Ridge Road _hit1.mov. Kincaid read it, then read it again. The lab's servers hummed around them. Outside, Red Rock Heights was dark and quiet. The file existed. Digital forensics is not dramatic work in the way people imagine it. It is patient and methodical, hours of software processes running in loops, a technician's cross-referencing data fragments against timestamps and metadata, piecing together broken files the way an archaeologist reassembles pottery shards with gloved hands and a magnifying glass. The team working Kaylee's phone had been at it since the small hours of the morning, and by the following afternoon they had assembled something that no amount of lawyering or story shifting could undo. A video file, mostly intact, with clear audio and enough visual resolution to remove all ambiguity about what had happened on Desert Ridge Road. Detective Kincaid called the prosecutor and asked him to come to the lab. She told him to bring a notepad. He needed to see this in person before she wrote a single word of the report. They watched it in a small room off the main lab, lights dimmed, the screen casting blue light across their faces. On the video began with familiar teenage noise, music from the car stereo, Kaylee's commentary, the visual drift of the camera between dashboard and window. Tyler's hands were visible on the steering wheel, a bracelet on one wrist, knuckles relaxed, steering with the casual confidence of someone who treats a car like an extension of himself rather than a machine with consequences. Kaylee's voice narrated cheerfully, "We're out here, Desert Ridge, going like 90!" The speedometer filled the frame briefly, confirming the number. The timestamp in the file metadata aligned precisely with the estimated window of Daniel Rivas's death. As they approached Daniel, visible ahead as a small yellow shape in the right side of the lane, Kaylee zoomed in with the phone. Her voice shifted into a teasing, performative register. the voice of someone playing to an imagined audience. "Look at this dude, all serious in his bike shorts." Tyler's response was a slow, amused drawl. "Should I tap him? Just a little?" Laughter from the back seat. From the passenger side, Miguel's voice was quieter, less certain. "Nah, man, don't. That's messed up." His protest was not urgent enough to interrupt anyone's fun. It was the protest of a boy who knew something was wrong and hoped that saying so would be enough without requiring him to do anything about it. The moment of escalation came in Tyler's voice, the shift from playful to deliberate. "Hit him. Bet you won't." A pause in the audio, the kind of pause that on a video recording seems to stretch and slow. Then Kaylee's voice, clear and unambiguous. "Do it. I'm filming." The car surged. The frame lurched. A yellow blur filled the windshield, and then came the sound that the courtroom audience would describe later in victim impact statements as the sound they could not stop hearing. The phone spun, landed on the floor mat, and the recording continued for several seconds. Feet and shadows, the blare of the stereo, and 3 voices. Tyler, after a fractured breath of silence, a laugh, short and high and immediately self-conscious. "Holy, did you see him fly?" Miguel, his voice breaking, "Turn around. We gotta stop, man." Kaylee, still in the register of someone processing through the lens rather than directly. I got it. That's crazy. Oh my God." The car did not slow. The music continued. The video ran for another 40 seconds before the recording stopped, long enough to hear the highway noise settle, to hear Miguel ask twice more whether they were going to go back, to hear Tyler say nothing in response, and to hear the gradual transition from panic to a different kind of silence, the silence of people telling themselves a story about what just happened that is less terrible than the truth. The room was quiet for a long time after the video ended. The prosecutor sat very still. Outside the small lab room, the ordinary sounds of the building continued. A door closing somewhere down the hall, a phone ringing at a desk, a printer cycling through a job. In here, the weight of what they had just watched pressed against everything ordinary and made it feel very far away. The prosecutor finally spoke. She quietly and with precision. "This is not an accident. This is a recorded act of depraved indifference." Kincaid nodded. She was already thinking about charging documents, about the specific statutory language for open murder in Nevada, about what it would take to seek adult certification for 2 defendants whose age would otherwise suggest a different track through the justice system entirely. The district attorney reviewed the footage in his office that evening, sitting alone at his desk with the blinds half drawn. Afterward, he called his senior prosecutor and said 3 sentences: the charges, the enhancement, and his intention to seek adult certification for Tyler Knox and Miguel Herrera, both. The authorization paperwork was prepared and signed before 10 o'clock. A stamp came down on the documents, metal on paper. A sound like a small, definitive verdict. It was not the last stamp that would fall in this case, not the loudest, not the most consequential, but it was the first in the sequence of official acts that would bring Tyler Knox's smirk into direct and irreconcilable conflict with the full weight of the law he had decided did not apply to him. To understand how 3 teenagers came to do what they did on Desert Ridge Road, you have to understand the specific gravity of each of their worlds, the individual trajectories that brought them to the same car, the same road, the same catastrophic decision. None of them were born cruel. None of them woke up that Saturday intending to kill a man. What they were, what years of circumstance and character and choice had made them, is a harder and more unsettling story than simple malevolence. Because it requires looking at ordinary failures in ordinary places and following them to their extraordinary end. Tyler Knox grew up with limited structure and limitless freedom online. His mother worked night shifts, which meant long stretches of unsupervised time in a house where the rules were flexible and the consequences for breaking them were largely theoretical. Teachers from his middle school years remembered him as quick-minded and easily bored, a student who might have done well with the right engagement and instead checked out around age 13 and redirected his intelligence entirely toward social currency. By 15, his social media presence was his most important project. Stunts filmed on backyard ramps, minor vandalism logged as content, minor aggressive commentary about people he encountered in public that he labeled as entertainment. He called ordinary rule-following people NPCs, a gaming term for non-player characters, background figures with no inner life, and treated the world outside his immediate circle as scenery. His worldview had a specific internal logic that people who knew him described in consistent terms. Tyler believed that consequences were for people who hadn't figured out the game yet. He cited the sealing of juvenile records at 18 not as a legal fact, but as a personal policy that the universe had written specifically for people like him. In private messages recovered during the investigation, he spoke with complete conviction about wanting to leave a mark before graduation, not through achievement or creation, but through impact, or through the specific kind of notoriety that comes from doing something others won't. The phrase he used was main character energy. The tragedy is that he genuinely didn't understand the difference between being the main character in a story and treating everyone else as props within it. Miguel Herrera lived in a different kind of world. His apartment was cramped and always a little short on something: money, space, quiet. His mother worked 2 jobs with the focused, grinding dedication of a woman who has decided that her son will not inherit the limitations of her circumstances. His father was absent in the way that absence becomes its own kind of presence, a shape in the room that is always felt and never addressed. Miguel had been looking for belonging for as long as his teachers could remember. And when Tyler Knox decided to take him in, not out of genuine affection, but because having a loyal audience is part of the machinery of someone like Tyler, Miguel had accepted it with the relief of a person who has been cold for too long. He spent 2 years orbiting Tyler's confidence, borrowing warmth from someone who had none to genuinely give. Kaylee Porter had discovered early that a camera gives power. She had built a minor following through a particular kind of content that walked the line between confession and performance. Part honest, part curated, always watchable. She had learned that the person holding the phone is somehow shielded from what the phone records. The frame creates a distance between the person filming and the thing being filmed, a psychological gap that can feel like protection but is, of course, entirely illusory. What Kaylee had not fully processed is that pressing record is itself a choice, that choosing to keep filming is itself an act, that the camera does not neutralize responsibility. It amplifies and preserves it. Court-ordered psychological evaluations conducted after the arrests described the 3 teenagers in language that was clinical and careful and nonetheless damning in its specificity. Tyler was noted for shallow affect, a reduced emotional response to the distress of others, along with marked traits of manipulativeness and an absence of visible remorse that the evaluator described as consistent with narcissistic and antisocial personality tendencies. Miguel showed significant anxiety and depressive symptoms, and with a susceptibility to authority figures and peer pressure so pronounced that the evaluator questioned whether he had ever made a truly independent decision in a social context. Kaylee's profile centered on emotional avoidance, using humor and the camera as methods of creating distance from feelings she was not equipped to confront directly. During the search of Tyler's bedroom, officers found a spiral notebook tucked under the mattress. Most of it was ordinary teenage material: doodles, song lyrics, notes in margins. But one page, dated approximately a week before the crash, held a phrase written in dark ink and underlined twice, the kind of underlining that indicates the writer wanted to remember it, or wanted to own it. People are just NPCs until something interesting happens. It had been written by a boy who was 17 years old and had never experienced a consequence large enough to interrupt his own story. He was about to. The first public hearing in the case of Nevada versus Tyler Knox and Miguel Herrera drew news vans to the courthouse steps the way a certain kind of story always does. Not because the crime was uniquely rare, but because the video was, because the arrogance was, because the combination of a documented act of violence and the documented absence of remorse produces the specific public fury that makes cameras travel. Details had leaked. A cycling victim, a phone recording, teenagers who had laughed on camera and continued laughing. The gallery filled with cyclists wearing yellow ribbons, and with community members from Red Rock Heights who had known Daniel Rivas, with legal observers who had read the charging documents and wanted to see the defendants in person. They wanted to know if the reports were true about how these boys had been behaving. They were true. Deputies led Tyler and Miguel into the courtroom in shackles, and Tyler's response to the cameras along the back wall was to raise his chin slightly, to set his jaw at an angle that communicated awareness of being watched and comfort with it, the specific body language of someone who has spent years deciding how they look on screen. Miguel walked with his eyes on the floor, shoulders tight, hands clasped together in the cuffs. Kaylee appeared separately, entering through a side door with her attorney, a modest blouse replacing her usual style. Eye mascara slightly smudged, eyes avoiding every face in the room with a studiousness that itself said something about the weight she was carrying. The hearing's central question was adult certification, whether Tyler and Miguel would be tried as juveniles, with the corresponding protections, sealed records, and capped sentencing, or whether the seriousness of the offense and the evidence of deliberate action justified trying them as adults, where the full weight of Nevada's criminal statutes would apply. The prosecutor presented a compact, measured overview: the GoPro, the phone footage, the forensic reconstructions, the teen's behavior after the collision. He spoke about the phrase, "hit him, bet you won't," as evidence of intent, not an impulse, but a challenge, a dare, a spoken decision. The defense countered with brain development research, adolescent psychology literature, and the argument that two teenagers who had never faced serious consequences were not the same as two adults who should have known better. As the prosecutor described the details of Daniel Rivas's fatal injuries, the specific mechanics of a high-speed impact on an unprotected cyclist, the pattern of fractures, the brief period during which he lay conscious and alone on the road, Tyler yawned. He did it theatrically, covering his mouth with both cuffed hands and tilting his head back, as if the medical description of a man's death was the least interesting thing he had encountered all week. The sound of the indrawn breath that moved through the gallery was audible. Elena Rivas, in the front row, pressed a tissue against her mouth and gripped it until it tore in half. The bailiff moved. The judge paused in his reading, looked up, and fixed Tyler with the steady gaze of a man who has been tested in many courtrooms and is not easily surprised. "Mr. Knox," he said in a tone that was controlled and absolutely cold, "if you are unable to control yourself, I will have you removed." While Tyler performed indifference, Miguel fell apart. His eyes moved from the clinical description of injuries to the photograph of Daniel projected on the courtroom monitor, and then to Daniel's family in the gallery. Whatever mechanisms he had been using to keep his guilt at a manageable distance from his conscious mind stopped working in that moment. His face crumpled. Tears ran silently down his face. He wiped them with his sleeve and looked ashamed of wiping them, which was somehow worse. Behind him, separated by a row, his mother sat with her lips moving in what appeared to be a prayer. Soundless, continuous, the prayer of a woman asking for something she knew she could not name. The judge's ruling on adult certification came after hearing both sides, and it was clear and direct. The state's motion was granted. Both defendants would face trial as adults. He offered a warning to the defense attorneys that was really a warning to their clients. Make it clear to your clients that this proceeding is not an entertainment. A human being lost his life. This court will not tolerate ridicule or disruption. Tyler's response, captured by the courtroom camera and replayed on the local evening news, was a small, almost invisible eye roll, in the faintest possible expression of an adolescent's contempt for an authority figure who had just told him something he didn't want to hear. Outside the courthouse afterward, those few seconds of footage, the yawn, the eye roll, the lazy wave to Daniel's widow, played in loops on local television and scattered across social media with the viral speed of outrage. Comment sections filled with the specific language of public fury directed at a specific face. People called him the most arrogant teenager in America. They demanded the maximum. They asked the question that would fuel the case from that point forward, the question that television commentators and armchair analysts and Daniel's colleagues at Station 9 and cyclists across the state were all asking simultaneously. Would this judge actually hold? Would someone finally make that smirk disappear? The trial itself began months later, in a courtroom upgraded to accommodate the public and press interest that had accumulated around the case since the initial hearing footage went wide. Jury selection was a careful, extended process, attorneys on both sides probing for biases around juvenile offenders, around cycling and traffic culture, around the specific emotional weight of a recorded crime. The 12 selected jurors were a cross-section of Clark County life: a retired teacher, a construction foreman, a young accountant, a nurse, a small business owner. They settled into the jury box with the particular stillness of people who understand that what they are about to be shown will require them to remain composed. Tyler and Miguel entered the courtroom on the first day of trial in ill-fitting suits that had clearly been selected and purchased for this purpose. The visual vocabulary of defendants attempting to appear less threatening, less dismissive, more worthy of considered judgment. The jumpsuits were gone, but the restraints were not. They were led to the defense table, and Tyler, to his attorney's evident relief, kept his face controlled. No smirk, no eye roll, a performance of appropriate gravity that lasted through opening arguments and part of the first witness examination before the cracks began to show. The prosecutor's opening statement was a masterclass in economical storytelling. He stood before the jury without notes, making eye contact across the row of faces, and laid out the architecture of what they were about to hear. 3 teenagers, a stolen car, a video filmed as proof of bravado, and a man whose 30 years of public service had ended on a stretch of asphalt where no one came to help him. He told them they would hear the defendants laughing as Daniel Rivas died, and that they would see, through the victim's own camera and the defendant's own phone, a sequence of events that left no room for ambiguity about what had happened and why. He was measured and clear and precise, and when he sat down, the jury was leaning forward. The defense's opening drew on the full toolbox of adolescent mitigation: brain development research, impulsive decision-making under peer influence, the absence of a fully formed capacity for moral reasoning in the teenage mind. Tyler's attorney described his client as a boy whose environment had failed him, whose online exposure had desensitized him, whose terrible choice on Desert Ridge Road was horrific, yes, and deserving of serious consequence, but not the act of a mind capable of forming the intent that murder requires. Miguel's attorney went further in the other direction, painting his client as a passenger in the most literal and figurative sense. A frightened boy in a car he could not stop, driven by someone whose will he had never been able to resist. The forensic video analyst called to introduce Daniel's GoPro footage walked the jury through the technical process carefully before playing the clip, establishing how the camera worked, how the data was preserved, how the timestamps were verified. Then the room went quiet, and the footage played. Daniel's ride filled the screen, the early morning streets, the peaceful rhythm of the pedal strokes, the turn onto Desert Ridge Road. Several jurors watched with the focused attention of people who understand they are watching a man alive for the last time. When the car appeared in the rear frame, growing larger with that sickening acceleration, two jurors flinched visibly. One woman covered her mouth briefly with one hand before lowering it, composing herself. In the gallery, Daniel's daughter watched the screen with a fixed, unwavering gaze, honoring him, it seemed, by refusing to look away. The phone video was introduced next, and the impact of its audio was immediate and visceral. Tyler's voice saying, "Hit him, bet you won't," followed by Kaylee's, "Do it, I'm filming," and then the sound of impact filled the courtroom through speakers positioned at the front of the room. The laughter in the aftermath. The casual, "Did you get that?" Several jurors' faces tightened into expressions of controlled effort, the effort of people choosing how they respond in a public setting to something that privately appalls them. Tyler watched the screen with an initially flat expression that, as the seconds passed, shifted almost imperceptibly into the ghost of a smirk, as if the sound of his own voice gave him something, some faint confirmation of identity, even here. The judge caught it. He let the video finish, waited a measured beat, and then turned to the defense table. His voice was even, almost conversational, which made it more effective than volume would have been. "Mr. Knox, if I see you smile during the playing of evidence relating to a death in this courtroom again, I will order your removal, and you will hear the verdict without being present. Is that clear?" The question landed in perfect silence. The jurors looked at Tyler. His attorney's hand came down on his arm. The gallery held its breath. For the first time, Tyler Knox had absolutely nothing on his face, no smirk, no eye roll, no performance of any kind. Just a boy, suddenly aware of where he was, confronted by a judge who had made it plain that the performance was over. Kaylee Porter had spent months in a kind of suspended state, not quite outside the case, not fully inside it, moving between her attorney's office and her parents' living room, and the interior of her own recurring guilt, with the specific disorientation of someone whose world has collapsed in slow motion. The plea agreement offered by the prosecution was not a gift. It was a transaction, and both sides understood it as such. Reduced charges, a pathway to a life that was not consumed entirely by this, in exchange for complete and truthful testimony against Tyler Knox and Miguel Herrera. Her attorney explained it carefully, multiple times, in the particular language of someone who wants a client to understand both what they are receiving and what it will cost them. What it would cost Kaylee was not a mystery. She knew exactly which relationships it would end and what it would feel like to sit in that witness chair while Tyler watched from across the room. She made the agreement. Her parents, exhausted and quietly devastated in the way parents are when their child has done something they cannot fully process, urged her toward it, not to save herself, though that was part of it, but because of Daniel's family. Her mother had driven past the ghost bike on Desert Ridge Road once by accident and had come home and sat in the kitchen and cried for an hour without speaking. Kaylee did not need to be told twice after that. On the morning she testified, she dressed carefully and plainly. A modest blouse, hair pulled back, no jewelry. People who knew her from her social media presence would not have immediately recognized the girl who walked slowly to the witness stand, eyes on the middle distance, hand raised to take the oath in a voice that was barely loud enough to reach the back of the gallery. She was sworn in and settled carefully into the chair, and then she looked, for just a moment before she caught herself, at Tyler Knox. He was watching her with an expression she knew well, neutral, evaluating, waiting to see what she would do. The prosecutor's questioning was deliberate and patient, building the architecture of that day brick by careful brick. He asked about the group dynamic, about Tyler's idea of filming something viral, about who had suggested the drive, who had taken the car. Kaylee answered honestly, with a consistent thread of self-implication that her attorney had told her would serve her better than any attempt to minimize. She had filmed willingly. She had posted clips before the incident. She had thought it was exciting. "I thought it was just a stupid video," she said, her voice shaking. I didn't think it would get that far." As statements go, it was inadequate. It was also true. When the prosecutor reached the moment of impact and played the relevant audio, Tyler's dare, her own response. Kaylee covered her face with both hands as her own voice said, "Do it, I'm filming," through the courtroom speakers. Her shoulders shook. A prosecutor doesn't require additional commentary at a moment like that. The evidence and the witness's response to it are a complete statement. After a pause, the prosecutor gently removed her hands from the question and asked her to confirm, in plain language, what she remembered. She confirmed it all. The dare, the response, the decision not to press stop. Tyler's attorney attempted, on cross-examination, to reframe Kaylee as the architect of the moment, a social media-obsessed girl who had encouraged the stunt for her own content, who had a documented history of provocative behavior and had been known to exaggerate stories in the past. Kaylee absorbed the questions with a steadiness that surprised some observers. "We all were," she said when asked whether she had encouraged the stunt. But he was driving. He was in control. He liked being the one who did it. The simplicity of the answer made it powerful. She was not excusing herself. She was locating Tyler precisely within the sequence of events. Miguel's attorney was gentler, asking whether Miguel had tried to stop what happened. Kaylee nodded immediately, describing his repeated pleas. He kept saying, "Bro, don't. This is too much." He was scared. It was the testimony that would most clearly delineate the gulf between the two defendants. Before she stepped down, Kaylee asked the judge if she could address Daniel's family. There was a pause, a brief, considered silence from Judge Hollis, the kind that signals a man weighing competing obligations. He permitted it. Kaylee turned in the direction of Elena Rivas and Daniel's daughter, who were sitting 2 rows back in the gallery. Elena's face was still and unreadable. Kaylee's voice dropped almost to a whisper. "I'm so sorry. I can't take it back. But I will tell the truth for as long as I live." It was an inadequate thing, like almost everything inadequate that people say when they have reached the limits of what words can do. Across the room, Tyler Knox shook his head slowly, lips moving around a single syllable, visible to the lip readers watching the courtroom footage later. The jury, which had been watching Kaylee, shifted their collective gaze to Tyler. His expression had said more than anything his attorney had. Expert testimony is the part of a trial that separates what happened from what can be proven to have happened. And in the case of Nevada versus Knox and Herrera, the expert witnesses assembled by the prosecution formed something close to an airtight chamber. The state's accident reconstruction specialist, Dr. Amelia Hart, I brought to the witness stand a combination of technical authority and calm clarity that made her simultaneously impossible to dismiss and difficult to challenge. She had spent 22 years analyzing fatal traffic collisions, had testified in over 200 trials, and had the particular bearing of someone who has made peace with the fact that her work always involves the worst moments of someone else's life. Dr. Hart walked the jury through a 3-dimensional digital reconstruction of the Desert Ridge Road collision, built from the GoPro footage, tire impression measurements, skid mark calculations, and vehicle weight data. Her conclusion on impact speed, approximately 78 to 82 miles per hour, was derived from multiple independent inputs that converged at the same number, a convergence she described as statistically robust. At that velocity, she explained, a cyclist struck directly from behind by a vehicle of the Hyundai's weight and profile faced near certain fatal trauma. The physics were not ambiguous. The mathematics did not leave room for a version of events in which someone could have intended a tap and produced anything other than what occurred. The absence of braking marks prior to the point of contact was the element Dr. Hart's testimony treated with the most emphasis, and the jury leaned in as she explained why. Extended skid marks, even partial ones, indicate a driver's attempt to reduce speed before impact, a reflexive or deliberate effort to avoid a collision. There were none on Desert Ridge Road. The only significant tire marks found were acceleration marks after the strike, indicating that the vehicle had sped up following contact rather than slowing. This was not a reflexive swerve, Dr. Hart told the jury, in a sentence she delivered with the measured weight of someone who has chosen every word. This was a purposeful continuation of speed toward a vulnerable person. Tyler's attorney objected. The judge overruled it. The sentence stayed in the room. The medical examiner's testimony addressed the physical reality of what had happened to Daniel Rivas in terms that the jury had been warned about in advance, given the specific nature of the autopsy findings. Multiple fractures, severe internal trauma, a catastrophic head injury sustained despite the helmet, which had performed its function and still been insufficient against the force involved. The examiner noted carefully that Daniel had not died instantaneously, that he had survived for a brief period after impact, conscious on the road surface, before the paramedics arrived, and before his injuries overcame him. Mark Tully, the man who had found him and administered CPR, sat in the gallery during this testimony with his hands flat on his knees, staring at the floor. The digital forensics expert tied the technical threads together with a completeness that left no gaps for reasonable interpretation. The GoPro's final timestamp, the phone video's metadata. Cell tower pings placing all three devices at the intersection of Desert Ridge Road and the crash site within the same 2-minute window. GPS data recovered under warrant from the Hyundai's internal computer system, confirming the vehicle's exact location and speed at the moment of impact. And, perhaps most damning in its ordinariness, a series of text messages sent by Tyler Knox to a contact saved as J.D. on the morning of the crash. Including, sent approximately 40 minutes before the impact, the message, "Roadkill run? I'm down." The message had been sent with a laughing emoji. The defense's expert, a psychologist specializing in adolescent neurodevelopment, presented his evidence with evident discomfort, the discomfort of a professional asked to provide mitigation for something that resists mitigation. He was genuinely knowledgeable about the science, the prefrontal cortex development timeline, the heightened reward sensitivity of the adolescent brain. The research demonstrating that teenagers are disproportionately prone to risk-taking under social observation. All of it was legitimate and well-documented. Under cross-examination, however, the prosecutor asked him a precise question. "Doctor, in your research and clinical experience, do teenagers commonly make risk-taking decisions?" "Yes." "And in those cases, do the majority of those teenagers aim a moving vehicle directly at a human being?" The expert paused. "No," he said, "they do not." The jury continued taking notes. The prosecutor's final evidence presentation involved placing on the table in front of the jury box what remained of Daniel's bicycle: a twisted frame, bent wheels, handlebars sheared from the fork, the small GoPro mount still attached to the seat post, empty now. It sat there in the middle of the courtroom like a piece of sculpture that had been made by physics instead of art, the precise shape of a catastrophic choice made by 3 teenagers on a Saturday morning who thought they were filming content. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, "the state rests." In the silence that followed, several jurors looked at the bicycle. Then several looked at Tyler Knox. The gap between the two things was the entire case. Tyler Knox's decision to testify in his own defense was, by every account, made against the explicit documented advice of his attorney. His attorney had spent considerable time and effort constructing a reasonable mitigation narrative. Brain development, environmental factors, the absence of a coherent understanding of consequences, that required Tyler to be a passive figure in the telling. Someone things happened to and around rather than someone who made active, spoken choices. The problem with that narrative was that Tyler himself undermined it every time he opened his mouth in a setting without a prepared script. He had spent 17 years being the most interesting person in whatever room he was in. The idea of sitting quietly while someone else told his story was, it seems, simply beyond him. He took the stand in a pressed shirt, hair neat, and opened with the specific register of a teenager who has been coached on how to appear contrite without fully understanding contrition. Careful word choices, phrases like, "I'm sorry for what happened," that centered the sorrow in the occurrence rather than in the perpetrator. He described the events of that morning as a terrible, stupid prank that I knew was wrong as soon as it happened. He said he had not intended to kill anyone. He said he had never imagined it would turn out the way it did. He said all the right things with the slightly off timing of someone reading from a translation of an emotion he has never personally experienced. The cross-examination dismantled the performance with surgical efficiency. The prosecutor had prepared specific social media posts, screenshots, timestamps, original captions, in which Tyler had mocked cyclists in traffic as free points and suggested that hitting one would be crazy viral. He had prepared the text messages, including, "Roadkill run? I'm down." He read Tyler's own words back to him, one by one, each one a documented nail in the coffin of the spontaneous lapse in judgment theory. Tyler's responses became increasingly irritated as each question removed another plank of his prepared story. His voice took on the sharp, slightly incredulous tone of someone who is angry at being held accountable in the specific way they are being held accountable, as if the mechanism itself is unfair rather than the conduct. When the prosecutor asked Tyler directly, "Did you, at any point, stop the car to see if Mr. Rivas was alive?" There was a pause that lasted long enough to be meaningful. Then Tyler muttered, with the flat effect of someone who has run out of better options, "We freaked out, okay? It all happened fast." The prosecutor did not raise his voice. "So that's a no?" Tyler glared across the room in a way that the cameras captured cleanly. "No, we didn't. We left. But people get hit all the time." The gallery erupted. The judge's gavel struck twice, firm and immediate, instructing the jury to disregard. Lawyers know that juries almost never actually disregard. They file it away carefully and return to it in deliberation. Tyler's attorney pressed his hands flat against the table and closed his eyes briefly. Miguel's testimony, which followed Tyler's, functioned as its opposite in almost every dimension. He had not planned to testify. His attorney had advised against it. But his mother had sat with him the night before and asked him in the particular tone that only a mother can deploy whether he wanted to face Daniel's family for the rest of his life, knowing he had not told the whole truth in the one place where it mattered. He took the stand red-eyed, hands clasped in his lap, and told the story without embellishment or self-protection. Tyler's suggestion, his own fear of objecting too forcefully, the speed, the figure ahead, his repeated pleas that went unheeded. When he reached the moment of impact, he broke down entirely, a collapse of sound and posture that was clearly involuntary, the kind of grief that cannot be performed because no one who has not experienced it knows how to imitate it. He said, between stuttered breaths, that the last image he had of Daniel Rivas was in the rearview mirror, growing small and still on the road behind them. Closing arguments crystallized what each side had been building toward for the entire trial. The prosecutor told the jury in carefully chosen language that the case was not about hating teenagers or denying the complexity of adolescent development. It was about what the evidence showed two specific teenagers had said, done, and chosen, and what the law required a society to say in response to those choices. He reminded them of the text messages and the social media posts and the phrase, "Hit him, bet you won't." He reminded them of Tyler's behavior throughout the trial, the yawn, the smirk, the statement about people getting hit all the time. He reminded them that Daniel's family had to sit in this room and hear the sound of laughter recorded at the moment of his death. "You cannot unhear it," he said. "Neither can they." The judge's instructions to the jury were precise and complete. Definitions of open murder, second-degree murder, manslaughter, depraved indifference. He explained the evidentiary standard for each. As the jurors filed out to begin deliberation, Tyler leaned sideways and said something to his attorney, the ghost of a grin at the corner of his mouth. Confident, or performing confidence, which for Tyler Knox had always been the same thing. His attorney did not respond. Across the gallery, Elena Rivas exhaled, a slow, controlled breath, the kind a person learns when they have been holding something for a very long time and have to remind themselves consciously to release it. The courtroom doors swung shut behind the last juror. The waiting began. The jury deliberated through the afternoon and into the evening of the first day, and the wait in the courthouse, for the families, for the attorneys, for the reporters in the hallway cafeteria nursing cold coffee, had the specific stretched quality of time that refuses to move at its ordinary pace. A word came through the courthouse at around 9:30 that the jury was continuing deliberations into the next morning. Elena Rivas went home with her daughter and her son-in-law to the house where the kitchen still held the shape of mornings that no longer existed, and sat at the table until late with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea she didn't drink. Tyler Knox returned to his holding cell and, according to the deputy who oversaw him that night, ate his dinner and fell asleep before 10. Miguel lay awake. The verdict arrived the following afternoon, around 2 o'clock. The notification spread through the courthouse with the specific speed of important news in a contained space. A buzz of phones, a quickening of footsteps, attorneys gathering papers and making calls. When the courtroom filled again in under 20 minutes, every gallery seat taken, standing room at the back, the air carrying the specific charge of a room full of people who have been waiting for a particular thing and are now about to receive it. Tyler sat rigid in his chair, his hands flat on the table, outwardly projecting the same calm he had maintained, with occasional failures, throughout the trial. Miguel's hands were clasped together so tightly that the skin across his knuckles had gone pale. The foreperson stood, a man in his 50s, a construction foreman who had listened to 12 days of testimony with visible attention and visible effort. The judge asked the first question with the formal precision that the moment required. "On the charge of open murder with use of a deadly weapon as to Defendant Tyler Knox, how do you find?" The foreman's answer was a single word: guilty. The room absorbed it, not a murmur, not a sound, a full collective intake of breath, followed by a beat of absolute stillness before the exhale. For Miguel, the verdict was second-degree murder, a distinction that the jury had clearly and carefully drawn based on the evidence of his subordinate role, his protests, and his visible, genuine remorse throughout the proceedings. The reaction in the room was layered and simultaneous. Elena covered her mouth with both hands, her shoulders shaking, tears running in a steady stream. She made no attempt to stop. It was the specific weeping of someone who has been waiting for the word guilty, and who, now that it has arrived, finds that it contains everything they needed and none of what they most wanted. Because the one thing they most wanted, Daniel Rivas walking through the front door, is the one thing no verdict in any courtroom in the world can give them. Daniel's daughter sat still, eyes closed, fingers tight around her mother's arm. In the row across the aisle, Tyler Knox blinked. It was not a theatrical blink. It was the involuntary, repeated blinking of a person whose face has just been confronted with information his entire psychology had been structured to prevent him from receiving. His mouth opened slightly. The mask, The performance of untouchability that he had maintained since the moment he first walked into this building slipped. The sentencing hearing came weeks later, and with it, the victim impact statements. Daniel's daughter stood at the podium and spoke with a steadiness that cost her something visible. Her jaw tight, her voice controlled, the effort of composure sitting plainly on her face alongside the grief she was no longer trying to conceal. She told the courtroom that her father had taught her to ride a bicycle in the parking lot of his fire station, guiding her by the back of her seat until he was just running alongside her and then not running at all, and she was doing it herself. She told them about his empty chair at family dinners, about the way her daughter asked for him using the past tense now without understanding why, about the specific cruelty of a voicemail on her phone that she could not bring herself to delete because it contained the last ordinary sound of her father's voice. She turned to the defense table at the end, looking directly at Tyler Knox. "He was a human being," she said, "not a clip, not content, a human being." Judge Hollis removed his glasses before he spoke, which seemed to be a signal to the room that what followed would be different from the formal language of the proceedings. He addressed Tyler Knox directly, in the tone of a man who has made his decision and wants to explain its full weight. He noted Tyler's behavior from the first hearing: the wave to Daniel's widow, the yawn during the medical testimony, the smirk at the playing of the impact video. He read, from his prepared notes, the text message sent 40 minutes before the crash. He said that the law in the state of Nevada permitted him, given the specific evidence presented, to sentence Tyler Knox as an adult, not because of his age, but because of what his age had failed to produce. "You understood what you were doing, Mr. Knox," the judge said. "The evidence shows you understood it and embraced it." The sentence for Tyler Knox was life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years, plus additional consecutive time for leaving the scene of a fatal accident. For Miguel Herrera, 15 to 25 years, with parole eligibility after 15, in recognition of his lesser role and demonstrable remorse. Both sentences to be served in adult correctional facilities. As the deputies moved to take the defendants back into custody, the color in Tyler Knox's face drained from jaw to temple in a visible wave. The smirk, that lazy, practiced, camera-ready smirk that had decorated every hearing, every news clip, and every social media screenshot of this case, was gone. In its place was something raw and young and frightened, the face of a boy who had finally, completely, run out of story to tell himself. Elena Rivas watched him go, clutching the folded American flag against her chest. The judge's gavel struck the bench, once, clean and final. The sound of a door closing on a chapter that had cost an extraordinary man his life. Months after the sentencing, Elena Rivas drove out to Desert Ridge Road on a Tuesday morning when the traffic was light and the desert was doing what it always does in the early hours, holding still, holding the light in that particular low-angled way that makes the scrubland look almost gentle. She parked on the shoulder and walked to the spot where a white bicycle had been chained to a signpost by members of Daniel's cycling club, painted the bright yellow of his jersey with a small metal plaque bearing his name and the years of his life. Fresh flowers had been placed in the basket. Other cyclists had left things there over the months: ribbons, a small fire badge, a laminated photograph of Daniel at a community event, laughing at something out of frame. Elena stood in the wind and ran her fingers over the plaque. She stood there for a long time. Then she got back in the car and drove home. The changes that followed Daniel's death were concrete and lasting in ways that the community had demanded loudly and that the city council had, for once, moved quickly to implement. New dedicated bike lanes were installed on several major roads, including a stretch of the Desert Ridge corridor that cyclists had been requesting for years. Penalties for hit and run involving serious injury or death were enhanced at the state level, in part because of advocacy work done by Daniel's former colleagues at Station 9. Local high schools introduced a unit on driving ethics and digital responsibility into their curriculum. Not as a scare tactic, but as a factual examination of how choices made in a car and choices made on a phone produce consequences that reach much further than their moment of origin. The case was referenced not as a cautionary tale about teenagers, but as a real and specific thing that had happened to a real and specific person. Because the people who built the curriculum believed that specificity was the only honest register. Tyler Knox began his sentence at a state correctional facility several hours from Red Rock Heights in the adult population, with a prison number instead of a username and a daily schedule structured entirely by other people. His social media accounts were eventually deactivated, first by inactivity, then by platform policy. The followers who had engaged with his stunts and clips and aggressive commentary moved on to other content, with the efficient disinterest that online audiences display for anyone who stops producing. Letters from former friends arrived for the first few months, then thinned, then stopped. The thing he had wanted most, to leave a mark, to matter in the specific viral, a documented way that had seemed to him like the only kind of mattering worth having, had been achieved in the most catastrophic possible form and had produced the most complete possible erasure of the life he had imagined for himself. Miguel Herrera entered a different facility and a different trajectory. He enrolled in the educational programs available to him, earned his GED within the first year, and began attending weekly therapy sessions with the particular commitment of a young man who has decided that understanding why he made the choices he made is the only thing left that he can do for anyone. His mother visited regularly. He did not sleep easily. The nights were complicated by the specific intrusions that therapists describe in clinical language and that Miguel described to his counselor in the precise, unembellished terms of someone who has decided that honesty is the only remaining currency he has. A rearview mirror, a yellow jersey, the sound of receding engine noise on a desert road. He wrote a letter to Daniel's family in his second year. He did not know whether they read it. He sent it anyway. Kaylee Porter lived under a particular kind of quiet consequence that had no official name in the legal system, but was no less real for that. Her plea agreement had kept her from the prison sentences given to her co-defendants, but it had not kept the video from existing, her voice on it, her laugh, her command to do it. Former friends had mostly disappeared. New social circles were cautious about her history. She enrolled in community college and studied media ethics with the specific attention of someone for whom the subject is not abstract. She volunteered with a road safety advocacy organization as part of her plea conditions and continued to do so after the conditions expired, speaking at community events in a voice that never softened her own role, never distributed her responsibility across the group more gently than the facts allowed. "I pressed record," she would say consistently. "I didn't press stop. That matters." It did matter, and she had decided to carry it fully. Judge Raymond Hollis spoke about the case at a judicial conference the following year, without using the defendants' names, a standard professional courtesy, but with a specificity about the details that made the reference unmistakable to anyone who had followed the proceedings. He said that he had wrestled, as he always did in serious cases involving young defendants, with the question of what justice required in the particular space between youth and accountability. He said the answer the law provided, applied to the specific facts presented, was clear, and he had followed it. He said the most haunting moment of the trial for him was not the phone video, though that was haunting, but the moment he looked up from reading the charges at the first hearing and saw a boy yawning while the medical description of a dying man was read aloud. "That was the moment I understood the scope of what we were dealing with," he said. Not the crime, the absence of response to it. What remains, finally, is the question that true crime stories like this one always arrive at eventually. The question underneath the verdict, the one that the sentencing does not fully answer, and that the community memorials and the bike lanes and the curriculum units and Kaylee's advocacy work are all in their different registers attempting to address. Was this justice? Were the sentences proportionate, punitive, rehabilitative, preventive? All of the things we ask justice to be simultaneously, knowing it cannot fully be all of them at once. Daniel's daughter, asked this question by a journalist in the months after sentencing, considered it for a long time before answering. She said that what she wanted was not for Tyler Knox to suffer in proportion to her family's grief, because nothing could be proportionate to that, but for the sentence to mean something, for it to be a fact in the world that stood next to another fact, that her father had existed and had mattered. He was real, she said. The sentence has to be real, too. The last image the story offers is not the courtroom, not the gavel, not the face of a boy whose smirk finally disappeared. It is Desert Ridge Road on an ordinary morning, months after the trial has ended. The new bike lane is painted on the asphalt in clean, bright lines. A group of cyclists moves through the early light in yellow jerseys. Daniel's firehouse colleagues and neighbors and cycling club members, making their annual memorial pass of the route he loved. Cars approaching from behind, slow, consciously, giving space. A driver in a pickup truck reduces speed and waits patiently behind the group until the road widens. It is a small thing, the choice to slow down, made in a fraction of a second, without drama, without a camera, without an audience. It is the kind of choice that should not require a death to inspire it. But sometimes it does. And sometimes, because of what one terrible morning produced and what a courtroom decided to do with it, the road becomes a little safer for the next person who loves the early light and the quiet rhythm of the wheels and the simple, irreplaceable fact of being alive on an ordinary day. If you believe this sentence brought real accountability, or if you think the conversation about justice, youth, and consequences should go further, share your thoughts below. Cases like this one don't end with a verdict. They continue in the choices we make and the spaces we choose to share.